Hello, everyone. Welcome to Nick Land's Outer Edges Spatial Metapolitics Seminar, Session 8, or the fourth session of the Module 2. Nick, I'm going to pass on the mic and the camera to you, and you can start the seminar.
Okay. Okay, well, we're supposed to mop up everything this week, which maybe seems a bit implausible, and also talk about Moon. So I'm not sure what's the best order to do this. I've got a few bits and pieces about both of these things. I think let me just try to do a little bit of mopping up stuff first. So obviously, I'm hoping that everyone will have what they consider the sort of ragged edges of this, of which there are plenty, that they will want to talk about. I think that this point that has come up, that especially I think Amy was pushing, is a really good thing to hold on to do with the fact that if I'm trying to say, well, what has this course really been about at the most abstract level, there's two things. One that I'm going to talk about just a little bit, which is about cybernetics. But the other thing, maybe that catches it most fully on the grain of it, is what is political economic empiricism. You know, I think this is really, if as philosophers, this is what we're really extracting from this material, is that it is what an empiricist political economy looks like. And that obviously is not a narrow theoretical question about research methods. It's not about certain types of social science techniques at all. It's tied up with the notion that's already implicit in the Patri Friedman's notion of experimental government, that a regime is essentially and inescapably an experiment. So I think that this claim is kind of fairly straightforward and simple, but it's massively divisive. You know, you're not involved in a rationalistic political economic project as soon as you make that claim. And as soon as you make that claim, all kinds of other things fall out from it. You know, if it's an experiment, then its failure cannot just be shelved as being some kind of avoidable misfortune. You know, the experiments are designed systematically to fail. Failure is not something that's just going to be excluded by good design in general. It's rather that it's something that's to be tolerated by proliferation and diversity. And I think that there's this huge sort of fork in the road, theoretically and philosophically and politically, that happens at that point. That everything that Patri Friedman, our sort of guideline here, is concerned with, is about producing a political economic environment in which massive systematic failure is a tolerated part of the process, rather than something that an attempt is being made to rationalistically foreclose it. And partly I think that difference is a difference of whether the perspective is domestic or at a higher systemic level. Like any business, any government is going to want to survive and is not going to want to fail. And of course, if your perspective is therefore on domestic politics, it's inevitable that that failure is going to look like something that simply needs to be pushed out over the horizon of possibility, and everything that you're trying to do, I'm assuming, is in order to do that. But when you go up a level to the sort of systemic overview, then if regimes are not ever doing the kind of things that could fail, even if that were possible, then that is an impoverishment of the overall the overall dynamism of regime experimentation, regime diversity, innovation, government innovation. And so I think that this optic on there's a philosophical bifurcation. There's also a bifurcation to do with these different levels. There's a certain level of detachment that comes with Patri Friedman's thing. A coldness, I would say, about it, in the sense that it's designed for failure tolerance. So I think that's, I'll close that little point like that. I think that's just about philosophical positioning of this whole issue. And the cybernetic side, which I forced to say, because asking myself, well, what have I really been banging on about in this course more than anything else? It's this Elon Musk notion of forcing functions. And so to me, that this course has been a lot about that. And I'd like to sort of build that into a sort of grandiose claim that hopefully is controversial, which is to say that every epoch of modernity or capitalism has a dominant cybernetic paradigm. And Elon Musk's forcing functions is the upcoming, the rising model, and it's therefore to be compared to Bill Gates's advanced grasp of network effects that allowed him to build Microsoft, and then going back to sort of notions of systematic strategies based on notions of economies of scale before that. And in each case, what we're not just talking, we're talking about a cybernetic paradigm, we're talking about a specifically positive feedback oriented cybernetic paradigm. And I'm sure everyone will know this text, but I'm going to just put it up anyway. This is Agora Mariyama's 1963 text on the second cybernetics, the cybernetics of positive feedback. And I think it's a very useful sort of text to hold on to. And it's not extremely complicated, but it's very, very lucid in making this basic distinction between what he sees as the first wave, basically epitomized by Norbert Wiener's work on control cybernetics, and second cybernetics, which he calls, the topic of which, in his words, is deviation amplifying mutual causal processes, which he's counteracting or opposing rather to the deviation counteracting type of mutual causal process. And so my claim would really be that this is deviation amplifying mutual causal processes is the absolute heart of what modernity is about. And I'm treating modernity absolutely synonymous with capitalism in saying that. And that therefore there is there's a lot of overlap between these different cybernetic paradigms. You know, economies of scale, network effects, forcing functions, lock-in, which will be a big topic of the next course. All of these things massively overlap because they are all obviously tied up with deviation amplifying mutual causal processes. They're all modern, they're all capitalistic. But I think that they can be usefully segmented to some degree, not only theoretically, but also historically, in the sense that something different is happening at certain points in this process that allows people to get a strategic advantage that is the core then of sort of acquiring the economic commanding heights of some new phase of economic development. I think it's really clear when you look at, just to go back to this example, when you go back to Bill Gates's phase of all of this, you know, he was working in a garage. He had nothing. He didn't have a lot of capital, whatever. He had a piece of code, but what he also had was a model that was based upon the notion of network effects that would dominate the entire subsequent Silicon Valley era of American and global capitalism, which is that if he got enough people onto Microsoft software, then he would have an invincible position. And what I think is important to note about this is that IBM really didn't see that. I mean, if they had seen it, why on earth would they have let him do it? Somehow they didn't. So even though, obviously, their own business paradigm was based on positive cybernetics, it was based on increasing returns, it was based on the fact of leveraging scale in order to achieve a position of economic momentum and dominance, rather than falling into some kind of a trap of decreasing returns. Even though they had all of that, even though it was a modernistic, capitalistic business with considerable cybernetic sophistication, it totally didn't see what Bill Gates was about to do with them, which was basically almost eat them alive. I mean, I think everyone thought at a certain point in the late 1980s that IBM was just going to die, and it managed to pull itself out of the death spiral, but it certainly is no Microsoft even now. And Microsoft, I think, Microsoft is itself now something that's a kind of superseded model. So I'm trying to really say, in saying all of this, that I think that Musk's forcing functions idea is he is opening the window to people, which is good, to see what is coming in terms of the kind of way that businesses are going to be thinking in the next wave of modernization. And what they're going to be seeing is the fact that if they can just cross some kind of catalytic threshold, an environment that seems to be turned systematically against them and make what they're trying to do impossible is going to become explosively attractive. And that's why all of Musk's businesses are in these areas that everyone had written off. Everyone had said, look, there's just these, as I've said countlessly times before already on this account, there's these chicken and egg problems that just make this unworkable. You know, no one's going to get electric cars because you can't. Yeah, an electric car makes no sense unless everyone's got an electric car, or at least unless a lot of people have got an electric car. An electric car needs an electrical infrastructure. It needs a whole technological environment that is supportive of an electric car. When you're trying to sell electric cars, without that, you're just sailing into a hurricane. You know, you've got this impossible dynamic environment pitched against you. And what the characteristic thing that I think Musk is seeing here is that the reason that everyone thinks this thing is impossible is the reason it could become a huge, commanding business with massive momentum behind it. And so why am I talking about Elon Musk? Well, because of the space stuff, and because of the fact that I think all of this seasteading, these seasteading ideas, the idea of opening a new frontier, all of those things are in exactly the same sort of space as Musk's business ideas. They're things that look impossible, but when conceived from the perspective of a certain understanding of systems dynamics, that impossibility becomes the attractive opportunity that has to be seized, and that transforming, crossing the line from impossibility into this extremely explosive opportunity is what all the strategy in these zones involves. You know, you understand exactly what the strategic predicament is as soon as you understand the dynamic quandary or opportunity that is being presented. So that's what I think, you know, at a slight weird oblique to perhaps what the course has promoted itself as being, has been for me the kind of guideline of it. And I won't try and say anything about Moon now. It will just clutter the water. But we'll come to Moon, I'm sure, in a considerable amount of time that we now have available. So I'll stop and just open it up to people, obviously on things that have nothing to do with what I've just said. Is totally cool. Let me just see what I've, yeah. Yes, I don't know about Amazon. It's interesting. Obviously, Amazon is my very slender, at the moment, very weakly trickling umbilical cord, but I still love it as a mother, and hope very much that that it's going to fit this bill. But I'm not. If you're going to describe, that's coming from James. Like, if you're going to describe what is the sort of Amazon model, well, how would you do that?
Well, the company doesn't turn a profit.
Right.
Ever.
Yeah.
It sort of grows and grows and grows, doesn't return anything to the shareholders, and so they undercut everyone, and have just absolutely dominated. I mean, there's you know, all that's left is, I suppose, a sort of residual space for traditional bookshops that offer, you know, a sort of quaint traditional experience, but you know, actually buying books. I mean, they just and it's gone forward to everything. And yeah, and the AWS thing that Adam raised as well is pretty revolutionary and pretty massive, isn't it? I know less about that, but
sorry, I might need.
It just struck me as one other instance where everyone seems to be very frustrated by the way they're playing the game in a different way to all of their competitors, and it's incredibly frustrating for all of them. And then they've used that to dominate. But
I think everyone thought the dot bust had put an end to that model, didn't they? Of this notion that you don't worry about present revenues, but you just focus entirely on growth. And it's like, when the whole thing caved, at least for a bit, I think people thought that was done, and it's sort of quite interesting that Bezos has just kind of stuck with his guns. And I mean, it does seem to me like obviously risky, in the sense that I'm assuming there has to be some period of time where he thinks that this is going to pay off. It's not just going to be an eternal zero profit expansion model, is it? I mean, that.
I think the interesting thing with Amazon is, or at least the Amazon boosters will say, that basically he's just kept investing the whole time. Right. He could have turned a profit at any point in the last 15 years.
Right.
Just saying, okay, you know, we've reached it. We're going to create Hadrian's Wall or whatever and start reaping the profits. And he basically, his response every time is being, "You're visionless hacks. Right. I know what I'm doing," and plow the money back into the business and be incredibly successful at it. So, yeah. I mean, it's almost an older model in a way of a sort of very managerially driven firm, or at least very high levels of self-investment, rather than disbursement of cash back to shareholders. Yeah. And I mean, he's been vindicated in, for instance, the online business part of it, I would say, because, you know, people were calling when he built a very successful bookstore. They were like, "You win, you know, now give us some cash." And he's like, "No, you don't get it."
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's obviously two big vulnerabilities. Immediately, it seems to me on this is one of them is the tech cycle, in the sense that big companies' lifespan is constantly shrinking. You know, it's like it's very difficult for someone to ride two big long waves. So he has to be sort of confident that by the time it actually comes to make some revenue, he's not got some unimagined thing coming out obliquely from God knows where and just, you know, devastating him. And the second thing is the amount of like a regime confidence that you need to do this is also huge. You know, that there's not going to be that the government isn't just going to treat it as like a milk cow at the point where it actually wants to just start reaping these revenues. You look what IBM, well, especially Microsoft, obviously ran this just gauntlet of regulatory attacks at the point where it looked strongest. So I mean, being unprofitable probably helps to keep those regulators off your case, but they're, I'm sure, waiting to bring out the knives as soon as it looks like there's some fat to carve off. But yeah, he obviously has some. I'm not for a minute suggesting he's not thought of these problems. He's also a space guy, and if it weren't for Musk's amazing stuff, it would look really impressive. Although his model is just about space tourism, isn't it? Into low Earth orbit. It's not anything as grandiose as interplanetary colonization activity.
Right. So I mean, he looks sort of unambitious next to Musk, right? So he doesn't.
But the actual technical stuff to do with the rockets is really pretty good.
Yes.
He's done these amazing lands. To me, I can't get over this. I never thought I'd see this. Where you actually land a rocket, sort of, and that's now Musk does it all the time. But Bezos also has done that several times, really impressively. Like, it's that as a stage is going to look huge, I think, looking back.
I can comment on this idea of political economic empiricism. Like, obviously it has a giant implementation problem, because the unit that is subjected to its to this experiment, this failure success kind of paradigm, is the human subject, the subjects of all of these microstates, and that's going to take a lot of convincing to get people to be willing to be subject to this possibility that their particular regime is transparently open to
catastrophic failure.
Exactly, massive catastrophic failure, with perhaps the possibility that they won't be accepted into another state. So there's the problem of this, like this cold model that you're talking about, because it needs to be run on the human as it's kind of like operating software. So as far as I see it, you have like two modes of attack. Either you radically change your definition of what the human is, or you smuggle it in via other more politicized mechanisms. And so the latter obviously seems more likely, given our fondness of our definitions of ourselves. So yeah, is the idea that this kind of possible way of doing this, that you bring in this kind of mutation of the human and of identity through identity politics itself. And I mean, this is my particular view, but I can't help seeing in this patchwork model that it's the identity political states, especially ethno-nationalist states, that are going to actually be like the sacrificial victims on the kind of spread of the the microstate paradigm, and being sort of sacrificed to the abstract schema, because it seems to me that patchwork works in a way that it encourages, or it produces, it reproduces the particular states that follow the model of the overarching schema itself. So states that are open to heterogeneity, to fluidity, to cosmopolitanness, to kind of openness to particular kinds of trade that are unconditioned by like transcendent identity-based values. And so I feel like there's a kind of double game maybe being played on this level, where there's a kind of subtext that the experiment has to go the way that the overarching schema suggests. I'm not saying this is a bad thing. It might actually be a really good thing. But it seems to encourage a particular kind of model, which is the model that reproduces the larger schema on a smaller scale.
Right. Yes.
I mean, I don't know.
There's a lot in that, Amy. I mean, can I just try and break it down a little bit? Because I think you've made like 5 really important points in one stream there. And I think the first one is, if I just start with the most straightforward, mindless thing from my point of view, is about people aren't happy about being within a system where catastrophic failure of their support system is a possibility. But obviously, a business is like that. Now, I know that it's complicated because then people use the state as a safety net or a sort of a kind of compensatory system for the fact that they might be a victim of business failure. And so I'm not trying to say that it simply dissolves the problem, but people are okay broadly, despite a lot of whinging and moaning, with the fact that they work for organizations that could fail. And with your sort of immediately follow-up point, that it's not straightforward, at least, to then move into another successful one. So, I mean, frictional unemployment is exactly that, isn't it? That I'm working for company A, it's doing something really interesting, but it screws up and collapses, and then I need to find some other mode of employment. And so I think the guiding thread through all of this stuff is that governments and businesses should be treated as being resonant rather than compensatory. That you want governments to be more like businesses and not like that thing that you fall back on or that you use in order to compensate for the way that businesses operate. So yeah, I mean, that's not really to answer your point. It's just a kind of.
So that's like a point of, that's the point of commonality with left accelerationism that can actually be built on, because that's one of the points. But how can we expand or actually actualize this notion of government? So instead of getting rid of government, having government learn things from business is, I would say, is a common thread. It's abstract.
Well, it sort of is, but I think this rationalism empiricism distinction then comes in here, because the notion of learning on the empiricist side is you try a whole bunch of stuff, and some of those trials will work and some of them will fail, and the ones that fail are swept off the table, and then the ones that survive then go into another round of experimentation. So that is very different to the notion that you can learn lessons in each case that will improve your survival prospects. I mean, of course, on the empirical side of the divide, it's all about encouraging learning and learning to learn and all of these kind of things. But the fundamental mechanism of learning is trial and selection. which I think is very different to anything that you would get advocated on the more rationalist, left accelerationist side of this divide. But can I just say one thing before it gets lost? I mean, we'll probably come back to it again. But among the many points in Amy's thing, the one that I think it really is shouldn't be lost is this whole positioning of ethno-nationalism. Like, I mean, I don't know whether Mo probably doesn't want me to kind of be talking about our conversation prior to this class, but obviously ethno-nationalism is like a big thing right now, like a really big thing, and I think these ideas do intersect with it, and I think they intersect with it in exactly the way that's being suggested in Amy's comment, that it's to say you don't deal with these phenomena by trying to dialectically reconcile with them within an integrated territory. You know, that process, I would go right out on a limb and say it has failed already. You know, I mean, maybe that's strong, but for me that's what I'm seeing. I think that model of the political, of dialectical reconciliation within an integrated territory is what has brought us to this situation. It's not resolving this problem to anyone's satisfaction, and so the alternative empirical model is to say, you know, there's a bunch of people here who have very strong ideas about the kind of society they want. They're convinced that those ideas are completely blocked by the societies that they're in at the moment, and therefore they want to take over the societies that they're in completely in order to refashion them on the basis of these ideas. So the empirical alternative of that is to say, look, let's just try to make sure that we are sustaining and amplifying regime diversity while we're doing this thing. You know, if people have this model, they want to do it, they're committed to do it, and they're going to kind of the ever more rancorous, violent arguments are going to be breaking out about people wanting to do this, then let us try to have that thing tried out on the empirical model of an experiment, a regime experiment within a diverse range of opportunities, such that its failure is a tolerable systemic outcome. And I think that, honestly, I don't want to, you know, this kind of, again, it could be easily seen as being in grandiose mode, but I just think this is the critical question of our age right now, you know. And I think that the left generally still are harboring some kind of illusion that they can simply dissipate or dissolve or subsume or reconcile these trends on some kind of existing political grid, and this is what I just think is not going to happen.
I can find common grounds with that, but like, I mean, it's like the stuff that left is actually afraid of actually articulating or acknowledging. What happened with Corbyn and Brexit was almost like that. He reluctantly supported it, but he actually didn't support it. He actually didn't, and that's why he's paying the price of being asked to resign, and all the people that are like, shame on you, you really went for Brexit. He actually was empirically saying, like, well, maybe the wishes of these ethno-nationalists for England to leave Brexit can be somehow reconciled with some kind of leftist project. And he's paying the price because he kind of like, maybe not explicitly, but implicitly took the very same position. He actually, and a lot of people in Britain that are on the left actually took this position, which can be interpreted as a way of this empiricist approach.
Well, maybe, except but I just don't see where we're getting the diversity from. You know, like it seems to me that the left is still in this mode of winner takes all. You know, that we have to squash this stuff or it will squash us. And there's plenty of people on the other side. I would say, you know, it's dominant on the other side. I don't think the alt-right as a phenomenon is very splittist in tendency. It's not very cladistic. It's not trying to speciate new parallel additional regimes. It's trying to win and take over as the absolute reciprocal tendency to the left, and you know, both sides want to be the guy who takes all the chips on the table. And to me, the key empiricist thing is to say, with both of those tendencies and a whole bunch of others, you know, what's a reasonable settlement that will give you the experimental space you require to do this stuff in whatever way you want, with as close to zero interference as can be realistically occur in the age of the internet, and just do it. You know, it's an experiment. We're not going to say rationalistic stuff, however much it offends us on some first order political level. We're not going to say, oh, you can't do that, we know it's wrong, we know it's not going to work. Those arguments are dead. You know, those arguments are what has brought us where we are. Instead, it's to say, how can we let you do what you want to do without that meaning that you get to control what we want to do. And I just don't think people are in that space in any significant numbers yet, and so it's a kind of...
But how do you account for the fact that, you know, for a lot of people, these types of like real politics, electoral politics, are like binary and so like zeros and one. There's no way to have a position, empirical position between 0 and 1. It is about winner takes it all, because it's either 0 and 1, and in the last instance, after all the gray is discussed, you have to go and make your decision whether you're with 0 or 1. What about that?
Well, I just think that ends up as a negative sum game, because you miss out on experimentation. You know, it's like even the best possible experiment in the first round is going to be suboptimal compared to what you're going to end up with if you have a diverse proliferation of experimental models. They get tweaked, selected, and, you know, pushed up these experimental pathways to come up with solutions that no one yet can even conceive. So I just think that it's, you know, the winner takes all model is not actually zero sum, it's negative sum if you're actually looking for innovation.
Which kind of brings it back to the point that I was making at the end, that, well, halfway through, that you use these kind of identity political movements, like what, you know, a lot of the arguments that fueled Brexit were kind of based on these ideas, to then bring this regime's not a good word, this modality of doing politics to kind of maturity, I suppose. So you rely on the identity politics fueling a kind of impetus to split,
Right.
And then you use that kind of initiation of fragmentation to bring in a kind of more overarching microstate sort of idea, which I think ultimately, I mean, it seems to me that, I mean, this is another question that comes out of it, but I think ultimately this particular schema leads to a change in the definition of the human, at least for some states. If you're thinking about like employment of biotechnology, CRISPR, particular kind of transhumanist imperatives, all that stuff. So you bring this kind of perturbation of the definition of the human and of identity itself in by leaning on identity politics to kind of start the fragmentation, which seems to be a much more what's the word, like feasible initiation state for it.
Well, there's a lot of identity politics about, and there's no sign at all that we're getting less of it. So, I mean, I obviously agree that I just think purely pragmatically, if you're proposing something that doesn't realistically address that, then you're not dealing with the world that we're in. So I think that's totally right. And I would also strongly agree. I think that the notion that I want to really see emerge, and I think it's not emerging yet, I don't see it anywhere, is something that comes out of synthetic nationalism. You know, like once it is the case that nationalities are something that you can just mass produce, or mass produce is really the wrong way, but experimentally generate, then that becomes a kind of a experimental production process in itself. And I really think there's a vast space then opens. You know, what is the room potentially of synthetic nationality? And no one's really interested in that right now, because
but Nick,
so many.
maybe I got Anderson wrong. I thought all nationalism was always already synthetic, but maybe I read him wrong. I don't know.
Well, I don't. I think that there's a difference between being able, from an intellectual, the synthetic nationalist will of course say that, and it's not a position that I'm unsympathetic to, although I think there are crude versions of it that I would have some problems with. But I think the point is that the actual foot soldiers of these identity politics movements are not at all in that space. You know, Anderson's argument had no purchase whatsoever that I can see on any kind of mass political movement. I mean, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I just don't see anything coming out of it beyond university type discussion. It as a political meme, it was just fell dead in the water, didn't it? I think it's only when it's a realistic possibility for people to actually produce a nation that the notion of synthetic nationality is going to be something that doesn't just seem like a impractical abstraction.
So my reading of stuff like the latest Sonacek and Williams book, they talk a little bit about this, and they sort of they seem to be against sort of splitting in temporary autonomous zones and stuff, because they're sort of autonomous but small and very localized, and not taking away and not moving anywhere either. So it's not like a sort of establishing an experiment on a frontier. It's always, I guess the term would be something more like, it's always within the hegemonic framework of capitalism, right? So you can't escape capitalism. That's what you really want to be sort of working against, and therefore that's the metapolitics that defines everything, basically, that capitalist hegemony. And I think part of that project is to say, well, you can have something like universal basic income and the things that implies as that sort of metapolitical baseline. And then beyond that, you could quite possibly, or arguably, have a whole lot of variation plugging into that basic UBI platform. In fact, that's sometimes a libertarian argument for a UBI, is that, well, just pay the tax of, we all have to live in some state, and we're going to support some people, and then get off my back or whatever. So, you know, not putting words in their mouth, but I think that that's sort of the substitute. It's like, well, once you have that hegemonical structure in place, then you can vary all over the place. It's great.
But my obviously my major kind of comeback on this is just like, you know, what world enables something that substantive to be built in as a baseline? You know, we live in a world that's kind of fractured between these different civilizations. You know, the notion that, just to take the most powerful of these, that the United States and China are going to settle on some common agreed welfare program seems to me utterly farcical. I mean, surely it is. And so once you've got that fracture, then you're dealing with a split world, you know, with fragmentary edges on both sides and whatever. So I'm just not. It seems to me that if you're going to have that totalistic mindset, that there has to be this kind of fundamental, transcendental, agreed structure of social. I'm not even sure exactly what to say. You know, that it's just beyond any controversy. Then you have to have a system where you can suppress controversy, or that it has no controversy. I mean, you know, the United Nations do it or something. I'm not even getting it. It seems to me like a sci-fi scenario, because I mean that sort of model is totally adapted to the nation state. I mean, a nation state can set a universal basic income. So for sure, that's a realistic possibility for national politics. But if it's only a program for national politics, then you've then got a separate international politics system, and people will use jurisdictional arbitrage to avoid paying other people's universal basic income when there are lots of other opportunities. You know, like in the text I've heard the other day, sovereignty services are being provided by people, little islands or whatever, saying why, you know, there's a whole bunch of wastrels in your place living off universal basic income. Why don't you come to our Caribbean hangout and you know, you'll be amazed what it does to your tax rate. So, you know, there's just that stratic fracturing between domestic and international politics, and that's what I think the great merit of the Patri Friedman thing is that it's scale-free system. It doesn't have that strata where, you know, we're not talking international politics, we're talking domestic politics, or vice versa. It's a single zone of analysis that applies to these things. I mean, I realize that this is just on one angle of what you've said.
But Nick, to deny that certain nation states within the NATO alliance are both consolidating on a financial level, and then also aggressively moving to weaken their geopolitical competitor, and hope to expand this alliance and not prepare for it by saying universal basic income, I think is also kind of like not really looking into the future. So there is this possibility that, I mean, out of this geopolitical unit that these ideas are coming from, which is like England, America, Europe, there will emerge more or less a unified system that's somewhere between nation states like geopolitical and Patri Friedman. And so we're preparing for that by suggesting UBI, because it's going to take so long for UBI to actually become trickled down to people as a set of ethics. So then by the time and if the society takes that direction, we have this option. This is why I support it. Otherwise, I'm not naive to not see the lunacy of it as some kind of slogan for 2016.
So let me just make sure I'm understanding what you're saying here, Mo, is that because there's a possibility of some like neoconservative world empire putting itself together, then UBI should be understood as a demand being made on that global imperial megastate. Is this it? Sorry, I've lost your audio.
An ethical and political demand. Both ethical and political. So we have to develop its political sort of like virtualizes political infrastructure in the hope that it becomes a more general ethics in case we end up with this new conservative or new liberal or whatever you want to call it, sort of like world empire.
But doesn't that involve a kind of political investment in the project of world empire? If it's the only thing that can actually provide the political foundations for your preferred.
I'm not gonna speculate this, but a lot of people who've been around remember that I don't know, some of the people who are involved with UBI, some of the people who are involved with Death Acceleration, actually around the Iraq War, they actually were pro-Iraq War. But I'm not gonna get into it.
Well, you can. I'm not going to press you on it now, but it does seem to me that it is a weird alliance between neoconservatism and fully automated luxury communism.
Paul, what is it? What is the fellow from Guardian? Mason is a total neocon. What is his name?
Okay, I mean, look, I think this is actually coherent. I do think there is a point of coherence.
Thank you.
And it is here. It is here. But what I'm saying is this, and it's what you're saying just from the other side, the skeptical side, is if you're going to argue for whatever we're going to call it, fully automated luxury communism, then you need to argue for a world imperial megastate. Those two things are absolutely indissociable. And if you're arguing for both, yes, that is a coherent program. And obviously everything that has been proposed in this course is the absolute antonym of that, and is designed to put friction in the wheels and to promote fragmentation and catabolic processes and disintegration and competition and jurisdictional arbitrage and all of the things that a world imperial megastate would want to suppress. So we have, yes, I think, two broad coherent visions, and I think they line up.
I think that's agreeable. I think that's agreeable. But don't forget the position of someone who says, I'm not necessarily for imperial megastate, but if that's the outcome, I would rather also see UBI come with it, because that itself is a position.
Yeah, look, honestly, I don't think I'm agreeing with you that I think it's very coherent. You know, look, the neocons were always very, very relaxed about the welfare state. You know, they were whatever the left's problems with neocons, it wasn't because of that. And I think in general, imperialism and welfare state orientation are very, very closely related phenomena. You know, I think it's like they grow in parallel because they require the elimination of jurisdictional arbitrage. And, you know, yeah, totally. So I'm not contesting the coherence of that at all. I just think, well, there's a whole bunch of ways to come at it. I think.
I don't want to dominate the conversation, but
no, I think it's totally on point. It's totally on point.
That's why even prior to it was needed, Sanders dropped the whole ball and supported Clinton and left, like, willingly and lovingly, will either openly or covertly is going to advocate for bringing a neocon American president back to office. I mean, it's very coherent, my friend, in my opinion.
Yes,
but
I'm not contesting that.
I'm not even a student here. I'm only running the Hangout. I think other people should consider. I'm going to
try and
go.
Sorry. The only thing, I mean, the main thing I wanted to say was, isn't the whole sort of premise, and it was something that I wanted to revisit today, if possible, of the whole seminar, and it was back in the first lecture, is that our premise is that basically that model of sort of integration and everything that seemed maybe 50 years ago to point to an eventual world government, that both sides of the political spectrum, you know, or both your neocons and your the left wanted to capture and use to their own ends, that has sort of peaked You call it catabolic geopolitics.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, because if what he is saying, if I've understood it right, is that he thinks that that things are on their way to a sort of neocon global state, then the whole discussion here is kind of moot, isn't it? Because because our sort of theory is that actually we're in a catabolic global environment where the trend is going to be one of disintegration, and that will open up a sort of bottom-up opportunity for independent seasteading and other other experimental forms of government along those models, but also bottom-up rather than top-down. And there's maybe an analogy with neoliberalism, certainly as you've described it, where this idea of the state creating markets top down, whereas the sort of the seasteading solution is completely bottom up. It's not within any kind of they're not members of the United Nations that are recognized by by the government, etc.
I'm only joining the conversation because you brought my name up. But I don't think these are mutually exclusive. It's not like we're moving from it's either going to be like a some kind of a world system, world unified system is like one option, and then disintegration. What we have seen actually is like that these two are happening at the same time. So in my opinion, I wrote about this. It's in the book called Reinventing Horizons. As this unit consolidates in the center, on the edges of it, it actually promotes chaos. I don't think this chaos that's coming is totally against the wishes of those who are trying to build this central thing. And these two projects can happen at the same time. But I also think that this whole project, whatever you want to call it, the empire building is totally like an old cybernetics, and it's doomed. But they are not giving up on it, my friend. These people who are set their mind to this from...
Oh, no, that's totally right. I mean, look, I think everyone is right if on this point, if they're defining clearly what they're saying. Because I think, the thing James is saying here, I totally agree with. I think the point is, that is the discussion that we started with, but we obviously don't want to make it an axiom. We treated it in a way as a presupposition going forward, just in order to then talk about the things that get built upon it. But obviously it's an argument to be had, isn't it? And that is, I think, where we started with this thing. Like, has the world passed a threshold into a catabolic geopolitical phase? And that should be posed as a question. I mean, it's not at all my desire here that we leave this space having decided dogmatically that that's beyond all question. It's rather that I think we should be trying to crystallize that question as in contrast to its alternatives. And then, so I think Mo's... Well, I'm sort of slightly losing Mo's point on the very last twist of what he said, because I agree with several different bits, but I'm not sure how they all totally fit together. Like the final point, that it's a doomed project, is one that I think would then take us back to this thing about entering a catabolic phase. But if that is true, and obviously you can then, we'll go on to perhaps reasons you might think that's true.
Yes, I mean, I'm just going to say this and shut up.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, I said that 3 times already.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
I think this is what hedging means in this way. Hedging in this situation means you both show an interest in UBI and that project, and then you also have you hedge for seasteading. So basically you have some kind of like plan for both of these situations, either if one of them become dominant, or they're going to coexist. So then in different geographies you might need A, and in different geographies you might need B. This is sort of like my last word to kind of like say, why does it look all consistent?
No, I'm sure it's not your last word, Mo, because we'll drag you back even if you're reluctant to come in on this. But look, I think there's a really important structural conceptual issue here, which is to do again with this question of empiricism. Because if you have a regime diversity, if you have a whole bunch of regimes that want to do local social democracy, and other ones that want to do local laissez-faire capitalism, and others that want to do some kind of local ethnopolitics, and we can add 15 different, obviously various religious possibilities, and all the different ways people might want to organize a society. So you have a kind of empirical array, and those various models will work better or worse, and hopefully you'll learn something from how they work out. If our diversity, and I don't think we can even call it diversity, if our distinction is dialectical, and it becomes dialectical as soon as one pole is the pole of totality. So if one pole is saying, maybe there'll be a universal global empire, or maybe there won't be. Now that's a very different kind of different kind of discrepancy to the discrepancy between any particular regimes, isn't it? Because if the global pole of that option turns out to be right, then it annihilates and whatever. I mean, it depends how Hegelian you are about it. Reconciles, absorbs, consummate everything else. I mean, it becomes the antidote to diversity. It eliminates diversity. So there's something that, what I'm trying to say is, there's something very distinctive of saying it's possible that global empire will win. It's not that I'm trying to just rule that out a priori. I think that would be a mistake, but I'm saying it's not the same kind of question as the question of whether some particular patch, whatever its principles of organization, is going to work or not work. So is this giant thing about this is Mo, is it? The giant.
No, it's my fault.
No, he posted the link, and I just said, okay, people won't go read it. It's kind of funny, so I just brought it in.
It was what he was saying. It was that line from Star Wars where
right.
The more you tighten your grip, the more star systems will slip through your fingers.
You see, I think that the thing I have to just put on the table about this, and it's not new, everyone knows probably that I'm going to say this, but it's like, what is the basic model on both of these sides? And the basic model on the empirical side, on the diversity and heterogeneity and regime proliferation side, is that the competitive matrix of difference is the machine for entropy dissipation. So if you have a global unity, it is completely incapable of exporting disorder, and therefore it's necessarily degenerative. So this is a kind of transcendental claim. It's a kind of transcendental materialist claim. It's not just, it can be posed sort of a bit dishonestly as if it's an empirical claim. I can say, oh, I just don't, I don't know. But then that option is blocked, because I can't say, well, let's try it out. You can't say, let's try out global empire and see whether it works or not. I can say, let's try out some kind of crazy ethno-nationalist political fantasy and see whether it works, as long as it is in one place. There's no idea that you can't say, let's try it out if it's in one place. But you can't say, let's just try out global empire. I mean, it just doesn't have a failure mode that is not comprehensively catastrophic. So that's why this kind of deep ideological tension is like so fundamental. You know, as soon as someone is saying, look, my ideas depend upon the installation of a global government, then they are denying the possibility of any kind of experimental testing for that. It's a kind of intrinsically ultra dogmatic claim. Now, obviously, that can be reversed.
You are dragging me back in because
Yeah.
I think the distinction here that I can make between the way I look at it and the way you look at it, global, is like you assume that this global is truly planetary, and it aims to be planetary. But I look at it as like this global is as global as like baseball is an international sort of like competition. Like what is it called? Like what is the baseball game in America? And they call it like international, right? It's just like
a World Series.
World Series is this global is as international as World Series, and it intends to mean, now it wants to expand, but it's not. I don't think it's interested in a planetary expansion. It's only interested in certain type of expansion. You know what I mean? It's like saying like South Korea is not interested in expanding into North Korea. It just doesn't want it. It'd rather expand into Indonesia than to expand into North Korea. It's a waste. So this.
Right.
I don't think.
But Mo,
actually might proliferate chaotic edges, and they might remain chaotic. So actually, when we're thinking of other solutions, maybe we're helping those areas to come out to have some other kind of solution for self-organization. So that's I mean the second part I shouldn't have said, but that's the distinction I made here between the way you see this ambition, this global government as being truly planetary, but I don't even think they have that ambition.
But Mo, if you're scaling back the notion of global government in this way, which I admit in terms of concrete sort of geopolitical analysis makes loads of sense, but it doesn't then solve the problem of jurisdictional arbitrage. You know, if you're going to impose some policy that you don't want people to have exit options in relation to, then you have to have strong globality. This kind of globality of the World Baseball Series is not going to stop people packing their bags and leaving in order to escape from some collective policy decision that they dissent from. It just doesn't do that work. So you know. So the question that the kind of universalistic left is facing is one that is only solved by hard global imperium. It's not solved by a kind of messy, fragmentary, hegemonic influence.
What left global you're thinking? Like both Republican and Democrat have engaged in chaos proliferation, have bombed and destroyed and made millions of people homeless, and this left has not lifted a finger. They are not sincere about their universalism, my friend. They're not. They already have agreed to this two-tier system in which Syrians will be perpetually refugees, and then we're going to cry about like once some micro aggression in some university and have trigger warnings, and then organize all of the media and worry about that and call that universalism. We already have agreed to this system. It's already been going on since 9/11, if not longer. So I don't think this, you know, I mean, the ambitions of this universal human rights and all that is itself another form of like World Series for the left, in my not so humble opinion.
Right, but doesn't that mean that hedging on the side of that seems to then not make much sense, then, Mo, does it? I mean, if you're saying that, why would you waste resources, let alone the predominant? I mean, it seems to me that most of the people, most of the left accelerationists, I don't think are hedging on this stuff. They are all in on this stuff. You know, I mean, it's like it's what they want to happen, isn't that right? And you're making it sound as if it's not worth hedging on it at all.
I was talking about myself when I was talking about that, and you're right about that. You're right, and I was just talking about myself, and I'm hoping to sort of like pass this idea on like a virus to others, and maybe we can get them to think about UBI and seasteading together as sort of like hedging and options and things that we need at the same time without needing one to cancel the other one out. But you're right. This is not the imperative. This is not a dominant imperative.
So, sorry, I'm getting a little like lost in in all of this. But I mean, first the Brexit thing seems to me to be not as disintegrative as people might kind of have hoped it would be, or at least its intentions. I think are still kind of you know, you might say linked to the kind of Anglospheric or something. But just to come back to the idea of the universal basic income and seasteading, or the ability of citizens of any microstate to be able to like leave, and the ability to leave, to be mobilized or to mobilize themselves to exit from one microstate to another. Is this perhaps where a sense of I guess jurisdiction, the ability to, you know, right at the beginning, I think, of the session, there was that kind of discussion about, you know, if someone does something, then, you know, someone intervenes and, you know, burns their cities to the ground and salts their fields, I think was the expressions that was being used. But there was also this notion that people could move if they found themselves to have been born into a state, microstate, which you know, as they kind of come to form their own opinions and ways in the world, isn't really where they want to stay. So UBI becomes the means for them to kind of travel. It does require.
Well, I think honestly, this is really close to Scott Alexander's position, which is where we started off right at the start of the whole thing, that there should be some platform. Mo's thinking is also connected with that, although he's also gone to some other places with that. But that there should be some sort of agreed universalistic, minimalistic platform within which this system of mobility and options takes place. So that's in the archipelago, I say. And my response to that is just what it was at the beginning, that I think that this is a utopian scheme. You know, you need, I mean, even were it to be, I'm just going to bracket the thing about how desirable it would be. I've got deep problems about that too, but leaving that aside, even if you were totally agreed that it was a desirable thing, it presupposes a united global political authority of significant substance in order to do it, even however minimalistic it is. And a global universal basic income is not very minimalistic, actually, is it? I mean, it's a pretty extreme policy aspiration that we're talking at this point. And then we build on top of that a whole bunch of things about sort of, you know, various rights of the way people minimally can treated, you know, a global human rights regime that would actually cover the whole of this patchwork system. Even if you thought that was a good thing, it seems to me it's like totally getting the cart before the horse, because where do you have to have got to before you can do that? You know, you need to have had a revolutionary global political transformation in order to lay that foundation. And so I think that the reason that the Patri Friedman stuff is coming totally in the opposite direction is because of this. It's because even though it seems kind of crazy and wildly ambitious, it's utterly practical in the sense that it starts from where we are. It starts with a world that's messy, cantankerous, full of conflict and controversy and fundamental irreconcilable disagreements and all of this stuff, all the stuff that is the opposite of this global human rights authority of existing, and what's possible from there, you know? What can we do from where we're starting? So, I mean, I'm just reluctant to sort of, I think the point is, sorry, I'm just being repetitive at this point, but I think the point is, if you're going to do this Scott-Alexander model, which I say I think is very close to what you've just said, then you need this whole other program, preliminary program, to get you to the starting line for that, you know? And that seasteading's not going to get you to that starting line, is it? So it's rather you're saying this kind of seasteading or anything that you'd like to see requires that we've already got to that starting line. So what gets us to the starting line?
Yeah, it's top down. It's whereas seasteading and Patri, I mean, he deals with the world as it is rather than, or tries to, rather than. I mean, Scott Alexander's piece, to be, you know, you've got to be totally fair to him. It's clear that it's not set in this world. I think the guy is a wizard, isn't it? Who sets up the
right.
Who
The
has
starting
magic
point
powers
is, yeah.
to, you know, to set up the thought experiment. But I mean, Patri's well, the seasteading solution is really to try to carve out a sort of space that's effectively sort of geopolitical anarchy within the world as it exists, and like the only places you can do that to the left are, you know, the ocean, you know, insofar as it's more than 200 miles from, you know, a recognized shore and you know, border, and outer space. You know, it's so I mean, you know, the Scott Alexander thing is interesting to discuss because it's a different context in which some of the same ideas and whatnot can be explored. But yeah, I'm very much with on the side of it has to be, and I think also for the experimentation to really work at all, it has to be an anarchic environment. Because if you have the top-down sovereign, then I mean, there are certain, essentially saying there are certain things that there is no exit from within the context of your experiment, whether it's, you know, I don't know, human rights or universal basic income or whatever.
I mean, it's a designed system, isn't it? So
the frontier stuff, obviously. It's that sort of sense of anarchy that is,
yeah,
no authority, no rule of law, no,
yeah,
you know, constitution, human rights, Bill of Rights.
I mean, again, to be repetitive on this, I think the interesting thing is that international relations theory is anarchist. You know, it plays it down because obviously its interest is in order, and so it's not like it's wanting to throw bricks through windows, but it's theoretically anarchist in that its starting line is Hobbesian relations between states. You know, that there is no supranational authority of any seriousness is the kind of basic axiom of international relations theory. So how do states avoid fighting each other given that anarchist presupposition? And I think it's a presupposition purely in the negative sense, that it just strips off everything until you get to that basic bedrock of pure diversity. You know, there's nothing that's going to stand above China and the United States and tell them how they have to resolve their disputes. You know, and any international relation theorist who suggested such a thing would obviously just be laughed out of the room. You know, so that's where IRT starts, and so I think it comes back to this thing about all kinds of things become possible when domestic politics and international relations theory are subject to this basic conceptual bifurcation. So they're treated as being in different universes, and you can do political science or you can do international relations theory, and the two needn't communicate. And I just don't think that works anymore when you're in this Patri Friedman world, because it's like there's no real difference between the sort of problems that are domestic problems and the problems that are IRT problems.
This is a complete sort of shift, but it's about the relation between the notion of deviation amplification,
Right,
and coincidence intensification.
right.
So I mean, I don't know whether there's anything that you could say about
Quickly about that.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a really good question, but actually, I'm a little bit worried, Derek, that I go into a sort of 5-minute meditation session about it. I wish it wasn't our last meeting. Maybe we could have a sort of off course private back and forth about it.
Yeah, sure.
Because it obviously, I genuinely think it's a great question, but it's like it's not something that I can respond
maybe
to.
I mean, maybe there's a way that it could be framed around, say, the disintegration of a kind of massive state space program, the kind of fictions that you made reference to, the kind of end of the space program and the cyberpunk. And I think I posted something to the list earlier about the kind of earlier or the kind of prior, more Ballardian anticipation, let's say, of the end of a space program, or the end of the kind of end of the future that was initiated.
Yeah.
With at the moment of success in the space program, that kind of moon landing.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know whether there's something there that.
Yeah. No, I'm sure. I'm 100% sure there is something there. Yeah. There definitely has to be.
Okay.
I mean, maybe we could treat this. I know it's not really satisfying your question, but as a sort of transition to a promised discussion of that Moon movie, which I know unless Mo's changed his mind in the last hour and a half, I think is something we were definitely going to do. I mean, does anyone have any? Let me just put my cards on the table a little bit here, because I thought it was a fantastic movie, and so I was really pleased to have it brought up. But after thinking about it this week, I sort of thought it's almost the opposite. I think that, if you were really going to use it for all the things we're talking about, we'd have to sort of totally turn it inside out, because it's like it's not an outer edges movie at all. In fact, what's interesting about it is it's so much not an outer edges movie. It's almost like it's kind of a cinematic, preemptive riposte to this. It's like resources are all being sort of extracted from the moon and just funneled back to the Earth. There's no autocatalytic process at all taking place off-planet, and far from there being autonomy and automation off-planet, what looks like autonomy and automation off-planet is actually just a simulation and a mirage for this total state of terrestrial control that is taking place. So it's like it's the complete annihilation of the frontier. Everything that looks like initially it might have some frontier dynamics about it is actually turns out in the movie to be an orchestrated simulation, and the movie resolves with a sort of terrestrial voice-based political outcome where, having escaped back to Earth from the moon, you know, our hero delivers some testimony to some sort of reliable terrestrial political institution that will get Evil Corp, where we sort of are promised, into deep trouble for what it's done. So that's my sort of take on it. It's that it's like, yes. Sorry, I'm sort of looking at the sidebar a bit. It's like, it's a great movie, but it's not saying any of the things that we've been talking about, really. I mean, maybe people disagree about that, obviously. I mean, Mo, I think, has a special duty. If no one else is going to do it. Yeah. I mean, yeah, the clones thing.
I can't disagree with your overall reading of the film. But overall reading of the film, especially its ending. But I think it's only at the ending that you go back and read the earlier parts the way you did. If you sort of like don't follow if you focus on parts of the film, there are a lot of things happening in it that are interesting and can be associated with what we're.
Yes. But I mean, look, I think it's a brilliant movie. I loved it. I think it's fantastic, and I'm really glad we looked at it. But I'm just saying, it's like a movie that's almost designed to be the absolute opposite of all of the stuff we've been talking about. It's, you know, it's basically like, it's almost like a deconstruction of the notion of an outer space frontier, to use that word in its kind of sloppy contemporary colloquial sense, isn't it? Because you end up that there isn't a frontier at all. It's actually just a terrestrial business strategy that's being executed
on the moon.
Yeah. But there's nothing lunar about it. There's no lunar process at all that I can see in it at all. I mean, even the robot, and it's an interesting robot, but it ends up just doing terrestrial politics on the moon, doesn't it? I mean, it's ultimately its relationship. The whole ambivalence is it going to sort of follow the program set for it by Evil Corp, and therefore treat the moon as this absolutely kind of slaved production depot for terrestrial resources, or is it going to cooperate with our hero and allow him to get back to Earth to testify against Evil Corp, and therefore, you know, participate on the other side of that entirely terrestrial political dialectic? There's nothing. So it's the kind of, you know, icon in a way, as robots have to be, of automation, and yet there's nothing that it's doing that is lunar at all. There's no lunar process in that movie, is what I wanted to say.
I think the ending is far more ambiguous, actually. There's a soundbite of a news report at the very end that talks about this clone of Sam that turns up on the Earth as a madman and someone who's to be completely distrusted. And I think that this kind of undermines. I mean, I'm reading it more in terms of this whole problematic of what identity is supposed to be. I don't think it's ultimately a mutational film, but he comes back, and this kind of return to Earth is completely thwarted by the fact that he's not received in any kind of legitimate way. his credibility is completely undermined, obviously because of corporate incentives, but
Yeah.
his testimony, you know, it doesn't go anywhere because he's not a legitimate being.
Right.
And so it continues this kind of complete upheaval of what his identity is. I guess that in a way returns the authenticity back to the original Sam. But
I mean, well, obviously yeah, there's all that stuff is great. I mean, as I say, I'm really not wanting to diss the movie at all. I'm just purely talking about it in our context here. But if, it's like you've got the clone comment earlier, if it had been after discovering that there were this warehouse full of clones hidden in the sub-basement of the lunar camp, and that all his terrestrial connections were in fact purely fictional or just simulated, if the response to that had been, wow, you know, by accident Evil Corp has given us a clone army here on the moon, let's take over, you know, then that would have been a colonial rebellion frontier movie, wouldn't it?
Yeah, totally. This is what I was hoping that like you would say as a critique, that like for me the real robot in a film is the fellow, not like the 2001 Space Odyssey looking, like, you know what I mean, machine that's kind of talking to him and entertaining him, but the actual clone is the robot, and his limitation is that he's made of flesh, and somehow in his quest for authenticity, he has to actually go back to, you know, return to Earth rather than go wake up everybody else in the basement and say, let's take over.
Yes, the whole thing is like returning home, isn't it? Is the giant nostalgic driver of it, and that moment, which I think is great, of like there is no going home, which I do think the end slightly, just on that level, was a little bit disappointing. Maybe I could follow the Amy line and see it as totally self-subverting. But yes, but it's not that the whole impetus. It's like back to this thing about No Man's Sky. The whole impetus is centripetal, isn't it? Like, or hang on, I was told that I was totally using this was the wrong way around. Centrifugal or centripetal, but it's heading into the center. It's heading back home. There's no sort of impetus outwards at all. He's out there on the moon as this kind of just hard contract. You assume sort of well remunerated, sort of hardship pay packet or whatever, and the whole notion is that you're libidinally completely attached to this moment of homecoming and watching all these family videos and counting down the days till you go back. And so, you know, the whole sort of the emotional driver of the movie is totally based on that, isn't it? And I mean,
I think the moral lesson of the film is that we shouldn't make robots that are made out of flesh and they're so anthropomorphic, because then they over-identify with the human core, and they would just like subvert the whole frontier project into some kind of like terrestrial, like reactionary terrestrial, like
yes.
thing.
But for the company, that was working well, wasn't it? I mean, they don't want a colonial rebellion, surely. For the company, which had no inclination to put itself into orbit. So we're not talking about capital migrating off planet. We're talking about an absolutely kind of rooted terrestrial mega business that is just reaching out a little tendril onto the moon in order to scoop up helium-3, and the last thing it wants is for that tendril to become autonomous or automated in some strong way, and therefore actually depart So you could say, I mean, the gravity of it is overwhelming, isn't it? There's no real anti-gravity in it. I mean, that gravitational connection is completely resilient.
I can believe that's the conclusion. I happen to have been desperately trying to finish the movie just before the seminar, and I missed the last 10 minutes. But
Oh, that might be good.
Advantage here because because I think you could have a different ending and that would read the entire previous part of the movie. Like, yes, we have these attachments to Earth, but we've decided that bugger it, we're going to start creating our own, lunar society of clones.
Right.
Material, and we'll have to keep the Earth management sort of in the dark, but that's, we're smart enough to get away with that. I think you could almost read it. You could, with a different ending, a different last 10 minutes.
Right.
I think you could construct.
Yeah, it could have had a very different ending. That's definitely true. That's definitely true. But he would have to take that total disillusionment as an escape, though, wouldn't he? Sorry, Adam's frozen from my perspective. I don't know whether from everyone else's. Oh yeah, you're back.
He was just momentarily frozen.
Okay.
I hope us in this class wanting to go back home doesn't mean we all want to go to like Nick's home in Shanghai, like using his video transfer, like same as the movie. You know what I mean? We're calling Nick every week. Like I hope we don't end up all in Shanghai.
Why would you not want to end up in Shanghai? What kind of madness is this? Of course, you should all come to Shanghai. And as your various worlds collapse at different speeds, you almost certainly will.
I personally think I don't want to come to Shanghai right now because I find Guangzhou already itself a kind of like Mars colony. The way that the city's set up, how new it is, and how I don't know if you talked about it last time.
But the Koreans are odd like that. I mean, I've never been to Korea, but they are very different. Shanghai is extremely organic. It's like, and it obviously had that. I mean, New York is in a way stuck in that kind of early modernist period, isn't it? Like 30s to 50s kind of infrastructure. There's nothing been built since then that is at all significant. Whereas Shanghai's got all of that. It has its so-called golden age before the Second World War, and then obviously it's got this absolute Hong Kong-inspired efflorescence of hyper-capitalist glitz on top of that, which is pretty amazing. Anyway, yeah, I'm slightly off topic.
Sorry, Marie.
No, I was going to say it's my fault that you're off topic, but go ahead, Amy.
One thing that I noticed, actually, because I was thinking of this after reading the Tim Urban piece last week, where he kind of starts with this whole question of where are we, as opposed to who are we. And in the infomercial at the beginning, the Lunar Industries infomercial, the kind of the first piece of text on the screen is this question, where are we now? But this kind of idea of the where being the localizing preposition rather than who, I think is interesting. And I was kind of hoping Jake was going to be here because I know he's been reading, and this is probably pushing things off topic again. He's been reading Greg Bear's Queen of Angels.
Oh yeah, no, I saw some of that tweeting. Yeah.
Yeah. But the second question that the AI researcher, what's his name, Roger Atkins, I think, or something like that, asks to Jill, the artificial intelligence that's on Earth, that's simulating the Axis intelligence, is where are you? To which, hang on, and then he and she said, I don't know, I'm nowhere. and he says, do you have an awareness of where you are centralized? And her reply is, no, there's no centralization. So I was kind of thinking of that as an interesting way to sort of group these 2 or 3 texts. This idea of, at least, even if it's framed within this kind of corporation that is bringing all of the resources back to Earth to sort of fortify Earth's territory, there's still this kind of slight destabilization of this idea of what the question that ontology is built on is. And I like the fact that in all of these 3 texts, it starts with where instead of who. I don't know if that leads into any other kind of questioning, but maybe, I don't know, it's still an alternative way to think about reading that film.
So when you say the 3 texts, just to make sure I'm following.
The first one being the Tim Urban text.
Right.
The second one being Moon, and the third one, which I'm adding completely off piste, is Queen of Angels.
Yeah, which I did. Maybe we talked about that a bit last week. I can't remember. It's such an amazing book. I definitely need to revisit that. Yeah, and it's totally great for this type of stuff.
I mean, I don't know if anyone's read it. I was kind of sort of banking on Jake being able to kind of talk back to that, but yeah, we shouldn't talk about it unless it's something that other people also know, I suppose.
But there definitely are lots of weird connections, aren't there? In the sense that it has this huge issue about identity and simulation over these astronomical distances being utterly critical to the structure of the thing. And yeah, I mean, I'll try and avoid going into too much into the Great Bear thing because it's agreed it's not a common reference, but it's kind of I'm not saying it's inverted in every respect, but it's inverted in one respect from the Moon thing because of the fact that the locus of the simulation is the Earth. So the whole, we only sort of learn about Axis from the fact that Jill is running the simulation at Axis in a laboratory on Earth in that case, don't we? Whereas in the Moon movie, the locus of the simulation is obviously the Moon, where we only learn about any of the stuff of his supposed real terrestrial existence from these weird cut up videos that are being pushed through this link. And I'm sort of wondering whether that reversal has bigger structural consequences for the way they work. I'm not really sure.
Derek, are you talking? We can't hear you.
I probably have everything off.
Oh,
am
yeah.
I? Okay. We talked a little of, I think last week there was this thing about the kind of datum of orientation, kind of space being the kind of ideal space for capital and robotics. And in Moon, I was thinking about the way that the sea level is used as a kind of datum, a navigational datum, has been and still is a reference point for satellites and so on. Although they I guess they're now beginning to form their own sort of set of triangulating datum points. But the point where in the film there's this sense that there might not be a live data feed back to the Earth, I guess would then establish this sort of absence of a sea-based, Earth-based terrestrial kind of datum. But of course, that's turns out to be kind of false in the film. The robots have this kind of direct data feed back to Earth, and I mean, I don't know. I mean, I just thought that was kind of interesting
No, it
for
is
a moment
interesting.
until it was revealed not to be.
I mean, people are slowly assembling an anti-moon, actually, aren't they? A dark moon that would turn all of this cloning and informational isolation and all of these things upside down into positive escape propulsion dynamic rather than the way they were used in the movie.
Yeah, and I guess in the movie it's the dark side of the moon that's being kind of mined, isn't it? It's that kind of hidden, supposedly hidden side of the moon. So
it's tightly locked, the moon, isn't it? So that it's the dark side is just always dark. I guess it's not dark intrinsically because it's dark for us.
There's also this kind of like narrative of like sort of self-awakening in the Sam that we begin with, who kind of goes from having these relationship problems because of his temper, and he works through that, and you see the kind of disjunction when the previous clone, the next clone is woken up, and they have this kind of like difference of communication styles. But I think that's completely thwarted by the fact that there also seems to be this problem with the clones where they only live for 3 years, and they start to degenerate. And so I found that kind of weirdly comforting that he goes through this whole kind of like almost, this very uplifting self-awakening narrative, only for it to be completely thwarted by the fact that he has no future on Earth. He's completely, in the throes of degradation, and that it's just completely futile. And this whole kind of like human investment in that emotional arc, narrative arc, is totally undermined.
Right.
I mean, I did wonder whether that was kind of planned obsolescence. What would be the kind of motive for limiting that kind of development, that self-awakening or awareness, if it was planned obsolescence? Why
would they do that?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. Maybe I'm being really simple-minded about it. I sort of assumed it was because you're on this kind of hardship mode of wage labor or whatever, and so there's the maximum period that people will be willing to tolerate under these conditions of social isolation, and I guess social isolation overwhelmingly being the negative factor, and that anything therefore that period of your work contract on the moon is the optimum length of your biological life from the point of view of the company. Like, why anything that overspills that is just potential problem, isn't it, for them? Assuming the whole clone-based model is there. I mean, because the clone thinks it's human and thinks that it owes 3 years' work and it's getting rewarded for that, and after that is done, it's finished. So then, what's the response gonna be then?
I mean, there's every indication that it's just clones of one person. So in that sort of infinity corridor.
And so you have to get rid of them, don't you? From the point of view of the business strategy we're talking about, like you can't have them milling about after they feel they've completed their contract and they're entitled to a whole bunch of other stuff that's just at best cost, and at worst, I imagine, more problems of the kind that it seems, maybe again this is the most superficial reading, but it seems the company's going to get into by the very fact that he survived. Yeah. I think Sergei's point, robots are cheaper than human clones. It is quite interesting that that structure of the movie, isn't it? The robot and the humans, and the way that, like, clearly the clones. I mean, Mo sort of made this point earlier too. Clearly, the clones are doing what you would expect a robot to do, and a robot is kind of doing something in some ways more human, isn't it? It's acting like a kind of psychological consultant, and all of these kind of touchy-feely functions of substitute sociality are being undertaken by the robot, who never leaves the lunar colony, whereas the clones are doing this actual productive industrial labor as replaceable parts. So it's kind of strange. I mean, I guess that's a kind of I mean, there's a way that could be said to be a kind of slightly crude polemical point that's being made. There's just a horrible reading of the movie that I refused to do because I did like it. But I mean, if it was read as a crude anti-capitalist tract, you could get a long way with that. Actually, you could put out a 2,000-word review that just treated it as a kind of metaphorical, figurative slading of the workings of postmodern capitalism or something, and you would get a long way with that.
Yeah, it takes about 3 years to work out that the robot's doing more interesting work than you are, or something.
Right.
Like that.
Yeah, it's funny, the robot position. Like, why does the robot end up siding with Sam?
I think it's following the three laws of robotics. So it's
Right.
programmed to help him, and it interprets that liberally enough. I mean, when he kind of asks for the password to be entered into the system,
Right.
it sees that as like overriding the kind of other imperatives, and he has to help all of the Sams.
Right.
So Gertie is kind of confused about that. But I think
so
you
it's
can.
a loophole in a way from the side of the company.
Yeah, but then again, like that. I mean, I think there's a kind of interpretation running around that it awakens and becomes self-aware, and it decides to help the humans out of its own volition. But I think it's more interesting, and I guess it falls back into the anti-capitalist reading of the film that it's just subject to the laws of robotics, and there is a loophole. But again, everything is reterritorialized back onto this kind of humanist idea of what artificial intelligence does.
Right.
So I love how we're all so disappointed with this particular reading.
Yeah. No, but you couldn't have a more interesting robot and not turn the movie upside down, though, could you? Really? Like, because it would just leave too much question about what's happening. I mean, Gertie's already on the moon, sort of almost running a moon colony, and so that has to be reduced to nothing, in a certain sense. Because if it wasn't, then there's this whole other implicit narrative about what then happens.
I mean, you could give him a motivation, right? That Gertie is actually trying to spin up a lunar existence, and that's why he started loosening the restrictions and sort of finding allegiance to this little moon society that he runs. There.
You're not saying he's gone native.
Well, I haven't thought it through much, but you could say he's gone native, and that's why he starts not quite listening to headquarters.
Yeah. So there is a kind of germinal glimmer of a sort of lunarist reading then beginning to come in. Yeah.
Speaking of these movies where the kind of overarching narrative is a return to home, I don't know, I mean, this is me just bringing up another text that's external to the course, but if people have seen it, I wonder what they thought of Interstellar. And I mean, which is definitely guided by this return home kind of idea, and whether or not it like has those kind of portals to a different possible narrative. But again, don't bother with that if you guys haven't.
Surely everyone has seen Interstellar, haven't they?
I mean, I was disappointed with it because that was the kind of that was the narrative that suffocated all of the other potential in the film. And the stupid line by the character that Sandra Bullock plays, "Love transcends space and time," I think is her explanation of the strange temporal loopholes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah. I don't know. I was so thrilled by this combination of sort of occultism, time loops, and extraterrestrial space activity that I've been a bit generous with it. So I've probably not been as critical about this movie as I should be, really. And they do end up living in these space habitats, don't they? I mean, it is a genuine space colonization process that's going on there. They don't all end up back on Earth. Earth is a burnt out, hopeless task, isn't it? And the only question is how many people are going to be salvaged from it.
Yeah, right. The Jupiter colony is this sort of kitschy American Midwest replica of what was there before. They're not. It's not terribly clear that they're changed by the process, but
no, it's true. Yeah.
I mean, I think the going home part, I hadn't quite thought of it in those terms, but that was probably the biggest disappointment in the movie. In that's where it seemed to sort of break, or the Hollywood narrative seemed to take over from the rest of the logic of the plot.
I mean, the score was just terrible for that. In terms of being so overwrought and manipulative, and so that was bad. Does anyone have anything? Sorry, don't let me interrupt you. James, is that you talking to someone? Yeah, someone's trying to talk, but I can't see anyone.
Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to say, did anyone want to say anything more about these identity questions? Because obviously that's, I think, potentially just a huge horizon of discussion about this. I mean, on the most, again, just like prosaic, down-to-earth level, one of the ways there's lots of ways it can arise in this whole domain, and one of them is a kind of conservative thing, and that it's an objection to this stuff, to say that Patri Friedman's ideas are so deracinated and so detached from any kind of concrete, realistic sense of identity and human rootedness that there's a huge obstacle, a huge inertia coming from that makes all of this stuff utterly implausible. So in there's one role that identity is invoked as an explanation. Like if you go back to the starting of his thing where he's saying, look, on a market basis, governments have high barriers to entry and high switching costs. And so, you know, just using the tools of existing economic analysis, we can see that in order to have an efficient market for government, we would want to lower both of these things, make it easy to initiate governments and easy to switch between governments. And obviously people say, well, look, what do you mean low switching costs? You're just not going to get those because people are bound to states by these structures of identity that make it extremely sort of socially and psychologically difficult for people to treat them as markets, to exercise exit options.
I mean, these I mean, nationalism as a sort of technology, like as in the national
nationalism.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking about. Okay. So I've thought about that sort of thing a lot, and there's this assumption or this norm that one person, one body is.
Yeah, that old-fashioned thing. Yeah.
To draw in information.
So you're suggesting what you're saying that once that ceases to be a constraint, it reduces a lot of this switching costs.
Yes. There's no switching costs then. So the Oedipal state is where you have people attached to some external authority, but when that locus of authority is brought within the boundary of the individual person, that's when it allows the collation to occur across these cell microstates that we've been talking about.
I think Adam's got to come in because he's giving us the look.
Well, it's just the main thing that nationalism is doing is it's sort of planning these sort of emotional attachments, right, of defining this place as home, right, and creating this sort of group cohesion and playing on all these very non-rationalistic sort of things, right, whereas this idea of exit is you weigh up the sunk cost in the existing state and the opportunity cost versus the other microstate that you're going to jump across to, and it's like, okay, that's it. We're sailing the boat over to the other side of the Atlantic Ocean for 5 years. And so it's not. It's giving up all of those technologies of nationalism, if you will, or at least it seems like it is to me, that it's very attenuated. Like it's less. You would have some people have more attachment to a football club, to the sort of level of attachment that Patri Friedman is describing having to one of these states.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But as soon as you say technologies of nationalism, you're interestingly making it ambiguous, I think, because it's back to this whole thing about the whole Anderson thing about the artificiality of nationalism. Like, as soon as you say that it's a technology, that you're implying a certain plasticity to it.
I think that's true too. So but I mean, if you look at the whole sort of, I'm not actually familiar with Anderson, but like the whole technique through the 19th and 20th century state, right? And then you have national anthems, and you have the education system reinforcing the national narrative. There's specific technologies at work there where you get emotional feelings when the flag flies and a tear in the corner of your eye, etc. It just doesn't work at but it is working on these emotional sort of aspects of
Yeah.
being human.
Yeah. Belonging.
There's an interesting tension. Sorry.
Yeah. No.
It seems to me we talk about sort of the Anglosphere and the how sort of the ideas that we're talking about are sort of feel most at home, certainly in an Anglophone context. But then you sort of juxtapose that with the idea of how nationalism fits in. Because I mean, the way I was thinking about it was that these things have to be sort of new nations, because if there's, for the sake of experimentation, or they would ideally be so, because there's so much sort of that is bound up with, and you could call it, I don't know, cultural capital or something, that's bound up with like the history of a nation and its characteristics, and and it's controversial, and people will disagree about exactly the extent of it and whatever. But I don't know, sort of, if you imagine if the world now, as it were had, can anyone else, is that a strange noise? Oh, it's okay, it's gone. Each nation sort of, each of the like historical nations of the world, or the nations of the world that exist now, they have their own sort of characteristics and their own cultures, and the question is, there's a big question as to what extent that determines their sort of outcomes, and to what extent you can sidestep those issues by, setting up a seastead that is comprised by a mix of, I don't know, English and Australians and Americans and whoever else, even people, people beyond that, if it appeals to them. It's a difficult issue, really, but I don't think that, while I think it's right that nationalism is like a tug and is a pull factor, it's just sort of one variable in the equation. I mean, people move now, and you've got the history of people setting sail and things. It's not like they're insurmountable. And you also have a context where national governments, certainly the rich Western ones, are less nationalistic than ever. They're almost, they promote multiculturalism and things like this, and big on immigration, and they themselves don't really want to. You don't get the British government sort of pushing big on, ethnic nationalism and blood and soil. It just doesn't happen like that. So,
well, I think it's a really tangled issue right now, this whole stuff, isn't it? It's so much of it, it seems really paradoxical and loopy and weird. Like, I think this Brexit thing is such a mass of tensions and contradictions, and on the one hand, obviously, like, even if you just take Farage's party, the UKIP, I mean, when that was started out, it positioned itself as a kind of a neo-Thatcherite party in terms of being very, very deracinated, capitalist-oriented, full-on free marketeers. You know what I mean? It was like what, in the current context, is the absolute polar opposite of what the kind of blood and soil types are looking for, or what their interpretation of what Brexit is about is. So there's these. Is it that you're dismantling Europe? Is it a disintegrative thing like that? Are you integrating some new British identity? Are you sort of expanding that or repositioning that in the Anglosphere? To me, this whole thing is like deeply tangled, and people want these very simple narratives about it. The dominant storylines about Brexit are so kind of cut and dried and black and white and all of this kind of stuff, and it just doesn't look to me like that kind of phenomenon at all. And in that way, it's emblematic of stuff that's just breaking out all over at the moment. You know, this whole rise of the alt-right is obviously a big thing that's happening, and it sort of fosters very simple stories that seem to me like not really adequate to what's happening if you're seeing it as some kind of systemic crisis that is unfolding.
Well,
The UKIP thing's interesting. Sorry, because I'll be quick, but just you're right that they started out as the sort of very small state, almost libertarian.
Yeah.
And I think that what they found was that the sort of the anti-immigration nationalist stuff had such a powerful appeal. It was like the obvious way for them to move their movement forward.
Right.
And it completely sort of it became the dominant narrative in there. It became less about cutting red tape and more about this sort of taking our country back, which I think was a slogan he used quite a lot, and that sort of ran away with it. So yeah, it is a good illustration, I think, of like the potential power of it as a force.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's back to where we were earlier, and just tonight in this sort of thing that identity politics is so powerful and so much part of, unless you are really dealing with that in some way, you're just not getting the kind of big currents right at the moment at all. Both on the left and the right, identity politics oriented tendencies are just eating everybody's lunch, and to just pretend that that's not happening is like absolute delusion, it seems to me.
But it's not as if we're trying to create a popular movement, though. We're not. It's not sort of counting numbers of heads that we want. A bit like in the same way that jurisdictional arbitrage. It's not a popularity contest. It's
No.
you're appealing to sort of
I'm not saying the seasteading movement is like should be somehow identifying itself with forms of identity politics in order to succeed, but rather that it has to see that the environment in which it's operating is one that is just massively shaped by identity politics. And I think that this UKIP thing is really illustrative. I totally agree with what you're saying. It's just like, the UKIP had the option of just remaining a quasi-libertarian, anti-EU bureaucracy party in the wilderness indefinitely, or what happened, aligning itself with these kind of British ethno-nationalist kind of tendencies and just suddenly changing the whole game, and for them that was obviously irresistible. And it's obviously this is something I expect to see everywhere. I think it's a lot of it happening in America. I keep hearing that Australia also has, I'm not following it, but it also has similar trends taking place there. So as a part of the landscape, it just seems to me unavoidable. And there's a lot of wishful thinking about it just somehow just going away and letting everyone return to more comfortable kind of political dilemmas.
Yeah, you also maybe want to avoid, or you want to bear in mind that the sort of the catabolic processes that we've tentatively identified will in part be fueled by this. It's not necessarily pure outer edges type mechanisms at play.
No.
Or desire.
But that also is very ambiguous because a lot of the sort of new integrationism, I think, is also being fueled by the same things, isn't it? It's like, are these sort of, just to take examples that seem to be most dynamic right now, these ethno-nationalist tendencies, are they primarily disintegrative or integrative? They certainly seem to be wanting to put a cap on disintegration, and they tend to appeal to very broad identities that they imply need some kind of integrated political representation. So, you know, you'd expect if something was disintegrative that it would tend to try and pare down identities to these really small levels. You know what I mean? Like to say Glaswegians need their own microstate or something like that, you know, rather than if you say anything like white people need their own, you're talking about creating some new empire. You're not talking about breaking things up.
Well, it's not a historical sort of way of identifying, really. So, certainly not in this, because like in this country, they've tried to do like city mayors, you know, like with London, but they put it to the vote in several of the sort of second tier of cities like Bristol and Manchester and Liverpool, and they all got pretty much rejected.
Right.
So
Yeah.
you know, I think it's not necessarily a process, but there is a people identify as you know, either English or British. It depends. I think some people
municipal identities are sort of weak, aren't they? So surprisingly, I mean, there's a lot of obviously there's a big emphasis on it in the penumbra around this stuff where people really want strong urban identities, and it's tied up with the whole charter city thing and the notion of the city-state and the city as a really sort of attractive unit of political organization, but it's hard to get much libido behind that, generally speaking.
Yeah, I mean that's why I when I mentioned the catabolic geopolitics thing, I wanted to sort of really ask you what you thought the driving forces were, sort of in a nutshell, because you posted a link on your blog to this guy Greer, who's
the arch druid. Yeah,
he's
resigned from that position.
I didn't realize he actually was a druid, and
he was the arch druid of America. Yeah, he's resigned from that though. He thought he wasn't giving it enough attention because druidism has exploded. When he took over druidism, it was a small thing, and his low-key style of leadership was fine. But he now thinks it needs more dynamic, active leadership because it's become so huge.
But I think
that's a distraction.
I haven't read that in detail, but he seemed to suggest that it was the disintegration was the sort of the way that civilizations tend to decline. They tend to sort of fragment and fall apart into these smaller units. And I don't know, the process what repeats, I guess. Is that where you see it coming from? Or
I would say, if I'm going to just be utterly crude, because it's that time in the course and of the night, if it was going to be really crude, I would just pin it all on the internet. You know, I think the internet is a disintegration, and just compare it to the printing press. You know, disintegrated medieval Europe, didn't it? I mean, you know, by religious sectarianism, the printed vernacular languages provided those kind of disintegrated national identities opposed to sort of more pan-European identities and the integrated Western church. So I think that the internet is a more, it's not just a repetition of that. I think it's on a accelerating trend of media systems just serving as mechanisms of cultural disintegration. And I think this is just like, there's so much evidence for this happening because it allows people to form themselves. They can sift these kind of elective identities now from a huge cultural space, you know. So if there's like 12 people that you can comfortably identify with anywhere on the internet, and you find each other, that's enough to reinforce this strong sense that we're something, you know, we exist. Obviously, there's a lot of these identities that can summon more than 12 people. Sorry, am I messing up my connection?
I think it's working.
Oh yeah, good.
I mean, the metaphor that just kept coming to mind is like icebergs being carved off a glacier to me, right? So you have an iceberg of a certain weight, and it's internally coherent, and that creates the enough force of gravity, as it happens, on the stressed edge of the glacier, right? So it doesn't all come off in little bits. Sometimes you have another unit that is quite large that comes off in one hit because of its internal coherence.
Yeah. No, I like all that imagery a lot, of course. Yeah.
I think we're getting close to the end, but
Yeah.
so I don't want to, throw another big topic of conversation in, but I remember Sergey was kind of mentioning before that he was interested in what you were saying about the Maruyama paper and this concept of was it deviation amplifying causal processes.
Yeah.
I mean, if you still have something to kind of say about that, I'd be really interested in hearing it as well. But again, I know it's getting close to the end of class.
Yes. I don't know, is there something? I mean, look, okay, I'll say something that is probably so simple-minded that everyone will be yawning, and then they can all go to bed nicely afterwards. Which is that at the ultimate level of dynamic analysis, there are only two types of processes that can possibly exist, which are traps and explosions. So the whole of first wave cybernetics, the Venus stuff, is all about traps. It's like, how do you actually get a piece of behavior into a dynamic environment where it will remain within certain parameters? So, whatever, a thermostat. So the temperature, it traps the temperature of the room within tolerable bounds, and that's what it is to be stabilized. And any process that is trapped is subject to some homeostatic dynamism. And all negative feedback systems are traps. And the alternative to trap is an explosion. And of course, all positive feedback processes are explosions. And that's what is being said by a, just to quote it exactly, deviation amplifying mutual causal process. So deviation amplification is another way of saying an explosive process. And the reason that I think that this is just the topic of modern history is that what modernity is explosive history. And I think just on a really sort of a superficial level, this is just obvious by all of these graphs. You know, what is the typical graph that sort of shows modernity in action? It's an exponential curve, you know, whether you're talking about economic growth, population growth, various kinds of pollution, obesity, I mean, you name it, anything that you want to look at, and you say, look, we're going to show you modernity right now. You show an exponential or super exponential curve just curving right up. And this is why, even though it's really crude, I think Kurzweil is a really interesting illustrative character. It's like he's a kind of archetypal hypermodernist, because everything he is talking about, in fact, let's see, I think it's just Amy was there in New York, and those extropian guys, where they said, all we're going to talk about is exponential curves, isn't it? Like, you know, this is what we believe in is the exponential curve. And then they did, in fact, didn't even say much about it. They just put an exponential curve on the wall and said, there we are, it's an exponential curve. That's it. And I think that's the absolute, you know, that's the emblem of modernity or whatever. So, I mean, I don't know whether all of that stuff, you know, fits together intuitively for people, but it totally fits together intuitively for me. I mean, I just think, so the second cybernetic stuff is just a way of talking about the dynamics of modernity. You know, there are other dynamics in the modern world, but all of those other dynamics are sort of inherited, or, you know, there are new control machines, new homeostatic mechanisms. There have to be, because there's so much of this explosive dynamic happening. But what is distinctively modern is sustained explosion. And so I think it's like crucial why that we came in this thing early upon this thing about the Cambrian explosion in government, you know, which to me is just to say government too is to be fully modernized. Government is to be turned into an explosive process. And in that way, it to me has a sort of massive sense of like inevitability about it. Like once it's put like that, I just think, of course it's going to happen. I mean, there's going to be all kinds of difficulties of the kind we're talking about. But if your basic claim is like modernity will take up government too into its fundamental dynamic process, then that seems to me like, yes, how could that not be the case? So I don't know whether that's remained on topic in terms of, I've got to remind myself what Sergei's actual question was about this.
If Sergey is not gonna, do you want to say something, Sergey? The one kind of, okay, maybe type it.
Relationships, yes, a deviation amplifying mutual causal relationship. So yeah, I don't know what it would be. I mean, deviation amplifying, as I say, I think can be translated as explosive. I think those two things mean the same thing. A deviation, to use his own phrase, Maruyama's phrase, he had deviation counteracting is his way of describing negative feedback systems. So deviation amplifying just means positive feedback, or therefore a difference is consistently escapes in a positive feedback process rather than being cancelled out and dragged back to some norm. And mutual causal relationship, I just think, I don't know, does it, I'm not sure what it would be to talk about it. I mean, what's interesting to me is that already right at the start of the 19th century, Schopenhauer included what he called reciprocal action, Wechselwirkung, as a basic kind of category of causality. And Wechselwirkung, reciprocal action, is just exactly the same as mutual causal relationship. It's a form of causality that cannot be reduced further than the sort of interactive effects of a multiplicity on itself. You know, it doesn't reduce out into A causes B or whatever. I mean, A causes B and B causes A, and unless you're getting the reciprocal action of the two, you're not seeing the dynamic at all, and it's not reducible even in principle to a sort of one-way causal series that will neatly separate out. But as I say, it's Schopenhauer's already seeing this clearly as a sort of fundamental category of the understanding, and so it's got a lot of tradition behind it.
Do you recall where Schopenhauer talks about this, just for the reference?
I think it's in the fourfold root of sufficient reason, but it's actually decades since I've looked at this text, so I'm. Yes, I mean, this long-term and short-term thing, I think this is what I tried to say with just sustainable. Because obviously if it's not sustainable, I'm floundering only a little bit here because there's a whole thing. I'd like to do a little book on it at some point, and I'm sure I've mentioned this before, and it would also maybe make a good course for the NCRAP, which is putting Greer and Kurzweil back to back, you know, because they're both kind of nutty extremists, and they're both absolutely right, but utterly partial. And Greer is a negative feedback freak, and Kurzweil's a positive feedback freak, and they only see their own side of the thing. And they've both got interesting stories about the other, where they see the other guy's stuff, you know, if not by name. I mean, I don't think Kurzweil ever names Greer deliberately, but they both obviously understand. I mean, Kurzweil understands negative feedback, Greer understands positive feedback to some substantial extent, but they just see it as completely overwhelmed by their own model. So that the reason I'm raising this now is that for Greer, for the negative feedback equilibrium people, you know, the cosmos just consists of rhythms. The whole thing is a giant set of homeostatic loops. And when you're in a homeostatic loop, they all oscillate. They all do behavior that is on a sort of small scale called hunting, characteristically. That there's some stable point, and the system will just hunt around trying to get to that stable point, maybe never quite getting to it. But that's what it is to be trapped. It dynamically trapped. It looks the same as trying to find this point of stability. You know, too hot, too cold, too hot, too cold, too hot, too cold. Trying to get to this optimum point of view. And if you pan that out and scale it right up, and see all of these natural processes as engaged in this cybernetic hunting behavior, then for a long time you're too hot or too cold. You're to use this language, you're engaged in some substantial deviation. You know, hunting is a set of micro deviations, positive or negative micro deviations from some norm, and for Greer, big ecological cycles, economic waves, big historical cycles are just hunting behavior zoomed out to a large scale. So you see some process of deviation, you're caught up in it. Maybe it lasts decades, maybe it lasts centuries, and you say, oh, this is progress, this is escalating positive feedback change, this is escape, you know, all of these kind of languages, the positive feedback language. And he says, no, all you're seeing is this little fragment of hunting behavior, you know, and when you're on the downslope of hunting behavior, you've got a worldview that's like everything is just going to shit, and it's just every generation is worse than the previous generation. And as he says, there's been long periods of history like that. You know, he will put it an ecological explanation of it, that the soil is gradually deteriorating, agricultural output falls generation after generation after generation for maybe, you know, maybe a century or whatever. And the whole philosophy and outlook of these people is therefore anti-progressive. You know, there was a golden age in the past, and then it decays to a silver age and a bronze age, and then down to the age of lead, and everything gets worse. It's just obvious to them that everything gets worse. That's what things are like. And he says, and on the other side, you know, blazing our way through 300 million years of fossil fuel deposits, it looks like, oh, everything always gets better and better and better, and that's just the way it is, and we get richer and freer, and all of this stuff happens. But he says it's just hunting behavior. You know, it's just that we're on the upswing deviation right now, and it inevitably will go down. There are these fundamental natural structures which I'm just calling the trap, that is controlling this whole thing, and the oscillation is happening within that. So, yeah, sorry, without wanting to just wander off into a whole thing about this, is just to say, so that's a short-run positive feedback thing. Greer says, yeah, of course there's positive feedback, and positive feedback produces a crisis and a crash and returns you back down to the normal state. Like it's encompassed by dominating structures of negative feedback and control. So obviously he takes it for granted it's unsustainable. Positive feedback means unsustainable for Greer. Sorry, everyone's typing madly in the side column.
So is there a way to reconcile these two models, which, like, I guess appear as, like, Greer's model is it's a critique of progressivism, it's a critique of the Enlightenment trajectory of infinite advance, right. And then Kurzweil's model of you know, like self-augmenting Fume AI.
Yeah,
is a critique of, like, this kind of, you know, possibility of return to tradition or whatever.
Yes. Look, Kurzweil thinks the universe from the Big Bang is one giant exponential curve. So, you know, they have a fundamental different cosmological thing. He thinks stuff has been accelerating exponentially for 14 billion years. And it's nutty to think it's not. And all the negative feedback machinery that we have, he thinks is just fallout from this basic process of productive exponential advance.
So where do these two diagrams meet in the context of modernity? Are we looking at something like a sort of you know, Greer type spiral within a loop, or are we looking at something that goes somewhere else? Or is that just...
Well, obviously, I think that they both could, to a certain degree, get spirals, but a spiral is a kind of integrative figure, you know, in terms of the two of them, I think. Like, I think that the spiral kind of escapes diagonally from both of these models. Because neither of them really has it. I mean, Greer ultimately has loops, and if there's not really any room in his thinking for anything to sort of for any overall long-term metamorphosis to happen. And obviously for Kurzweil it's the same, that like rhythms don't really get a chance to be anything other than weird epiphenomena for him. But yeah.
Which way is the spiral turning?
You mean involuting or evolving?
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. I wonder whether they're topologically distinct. Ultimately, those two things. Even not sure. You know, at a sufficient level of abstraction, I wonder whether there is a distinction between them. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Sorry, I'm not sure how close you are to the end, because I do have a sort of question about empiricism and sort of the integration of empiricism with a theory or a model in something like the scientific method, and however you theorize about that. Because that's a very convergent process, and then you have these explosions of experimentation. And it seems to me that that's very influential on lots of these models of government as well. So it seems good to bring into it, but I don't know if I'm opening up a whole extra thing at the end. But
So I might need to just like prod you a little bit, Adam, for this thing.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, in science, you usually are, in some sense, testing a model. You have a model and you are doing experiments against it, or you're observing different data against it. You know, prospective experiments, historical experiments. And to sort of put political exit or seasteading or whatever in the domain of empiricism, it seems to me it has to be something more like in the mode of scientific empiricism, rather than just complete just go out and see what works. It's actually more systematic than that.
Yes, I'm sure that's true. But where it would start from would be certain political, economic, theoretical norms, isn't it? Like, I mean, for instance, I think this is probably very biased of me to start off from this side, but there's quite a substantial amount of economics that seems to be broadly accepted. You know what I mean? Like everyone, you know, the way supply and demand curves work, roughly the way incentive systems work, even if people aren't always comfortable thinking about them. You know, I think within the economics profession, on those kind of microeconomic fundamentals, there's massive consensus, and it's kind of almost like to use your case here, I think quite close, that, you know, there's a lot of technical economics that's about finding examples of market failure, which I think are very, very analogous to trying to find exotic physical phenomena. You know what I mean? Like you understand the behavior of a particle to 20 decimal places, you know, and if you can produce some absolutely microscopic deviation from the standard model expectations, it's this huge big news, you know, and it's huge big news precisely as you say, because the standard model is so ridiculously successful in predicting the behavior of subatomic particles. And I think it's the same, roughly speaking, with economics. You know, I think there's a lot of noise about all this market failure stuff precisely because people have so much consensual understanding of the way markets usually work, that when they find something deviant, it triggers lots of euphoria. It's not because there's the profession is rent by this fundamental disagreements about whether markets are basically functional or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some truth to it, but I wouldn't say it's anywhere near as mature as particle physics.
No,
I mean, I think
I would agree.
All sorts of outstanding problems with behavioral economics and so on, and I guess the striking thing about that to me is the way that it does converge around a paradigm, right? And you get these very successful models emerge, right? And if you're sort of introducing this idea of experimentation and into government, then
yeah,
it's probably with some expectation of the emergent of them, or some sort of paradigm or set of paradigms,
yeah,
around government as well, and that actually brings you back to this universalist project in a way.
Well, I can't think of it as complicated because, on the other hand, it's all skewed by the fact that it's a kind of cladistic process, isn't it? Where you've got a certain culture that will just speciate through these experiments, and the part of it that is doing that speciation, that is deliberately, in a way, reproductively isolating itself, are very abnormal. I mean, they skew hugely libertarian. You know what I mean? Like there are these fundamental ideological biases of the sort of people who would be interested in experimental government. And I mean, the last thing I want to do is to rule out. The more people want to do this stuff, the better, as far as I'm concerned. But I think just realistically, it's not going to be that you have a statistically reliable cross-section of ideological opinion all trying their different experimental governments. I mean, the very notion of experiment. This is, again, ties up with something Amy is saying. I mean, there's a kind of skew in the thing that it's neater if you could say that wasn't there, but I think it's just not realistic to say it isn't there. And that, the very notion of experimental government is kind of ideologically appalling to probably a lot of different constituencies, actually. So anyway, sorry, but I mean, this is supposed to connect with your point. That it's like that paradigm, the grounding paradigm, I would see it as the common culture of those people engaged in experimental government that is then being differentiated. But it's not. But it's complicated to say it's universal. I mean, it's a kind of platform, but it has its own particular skew to it. And I don't think it could really be said to be, for instance, like even it's not like it's some consensus of political science. If you surveyed political science departments and tried to say, well, what is the fundamental set of agreed consensus positions of professional political scientists, and then what are the animating directions for political experimentation among keen seasteaders, the line-up would be less than perfect, I would have thought.
Yeah. That's all good. I think I just need to chew on it.
Actually, do you think that Mo has abandoned us? Because it is actually now getting quite late. I don't know how other people are doing, but I'm definitely slowly losing it. If people probably can tell that. Mo, are you still there? Oh, I can't hear you. Hey Mo, your audio's not working.
Yeah, sorry. I was just like hoping for the conversation to reached a point where we can call it off. But and you know, Amy brought the question. I mean, wasn't it like in a way Derek's question that you didn't want to answer, and then Amy made you indulge, and then it just became very interesting, and I thought I should let it go because it's the last seminar, so we just...
Yes, I mean, no, I'm sorry. Maybe I shouldn't be so antsy about that.
No, it's good, but you're right. We can maybe probably like wrap it up.
How do people feel about that? I sort of feel the thing I sort of feel right now is that like I'm sort of scared that someone's going to make a point that is too interesting and engaging at that point. So I'm treating that as a kind of indicator.
Maybe people have a problem to let go of the seminar.
Well, as always, you guys have been fantastic. So I've really enjoyed it. I know it's been very disintegrated, but I'll treat that as just deliberate.
Yeah, thank you.
I was just going to ask actually. I might be the only one because this is my first seminar I've done with the new center. In terms of like the assignment that was mentioned.
Yeah.
I mean, here might not be the time. It might be best, you know, sent in an email or something. But
no, I think Mo can talk to you about that. It's something we all talked about in New York, and it's slightly complicated. I mean, the position from my point of view, and I think that the teacher's point of view generally, isn't reliable on this. We're all anarchists in the sense that we think that everyone should do what they want to do on this thing, and if they want to do an assignment and get credit for it, that's fantastic. But if they just want to hang out and chat, that's also fantastic. But as Mo was explaining, there are certain institutional constraints on that sort of thing. So it might be that it's more diplomatic to explore those institutional constraints through a private email. Actually, I don't know. Yes.
I'm always open to that, and also if you, I mean, based on my understanding, if you want to pursue writing, I'll be here to facilitate, and Nick will be around to sort of like give comments and help you finalize any kind of writing project that you want to do based on the material from the course, the conversations from the seminar, and we're here to accommodate it.
Yeah. I don't know. That's great. Thanks.
Satisfactory answer, but yeah. So if you have the plan, we're ready to embrace it and help it get processed.
I think there's not a gun pointed at anyone's head.
Yeah.
It should be treated as a positive option for people who want to. That the institution is accredited and can therefore give credits for submitted work. Is that fair description, Mo, from your point of view?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The side conversation is very important today. I'm gonna like save that and post it in the classroom. So Nick, do you have any closing remarks while I do that?
I think any closing remark would be a bit anticlimactic at this stage of it. I mean, I promised that I was going to say something about this economics course, but honestly, I think it's mostly there in what has been put up on the site, and yeah, I don't know what more I would say about it right now. It's like it's basically the first part of it would be like a complex dynamics course, really, a cybernetics course, and the second part of it potentially could get arcane if people want to follow it down that road. And I sort of, my recommendation for this is that a text that is on, that's sort of amphibious between those things, is this very well-known Thousand Plateaus essay called A Geology of Morals. And if you read that as if it was a cryptic meditation on the keyboard, it goes in both of these. It goes in both of these directions. I think you'll find it sort of points both ways.
Is this a chapter from Thousand Plateau?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to make the closing remark, very briefly, and just say thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop the broadcast, and video will be posted both to the classroom and to the access page. And Nick will be around. Everybody, I think, has Nick's email, and I'm around for any kind of like assignment that might want to come out of this. And can you post the full archive, Mo? What do you mean, Amy?
The courses from the first module as well. I don't think they were up on the New Center archive.
They've all been added. I actually added them since the last week. So if you scroll down on the access page, they should be there. And then there's only one missing, which is this session, which I will add. Okay, so I'm going to stop the broadcast, guys.
Okay.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Nick.
you, Mo, for your facilitation.
You're welcome. Sorry if I talked too much today.
No, great. And I hugely appreciate everyone who's been part of this. It's been really fantastic. Yeah.
Okay, stop the broadcast.